"Ah, Mr. Winter, there you are, as timely as the sun and moon," Mr. Moore exclaimed as best he could from a wing-back armchair, one of a pair placed near the presently active fireplace in his business parlour, after his guest had been introduced and led into the room. George Moore was a pale, grey gentleman, early into his 7th decade, who, despite his age, the enervated tone of voice that came with it, and somewhat frail appearance under his lap blanket, was of a quick and cheerful mind. He, in fact, was uncommonly able, regularly walking his grounds to keep an eye on his small apple orchard, riding on occasion through the Manors Park to take a few shots at his woodcocks, and obliging his wife's social schedule, which had him dining in Cheltenham or Gloucester here and there. Indeed, he had little in the way of physical maladies, save a pinch of gout, presently resolving that kept him from rising upon Mr. Winter's arrival. "Thank you, sir, though to be fair I'm not known for such. Certainly I find little pleasure in the subtle push of a watch inside my waistcoat against my person, especially along a walk such as the one I've just accomplished. I've only brought one today to keep me motivated," he said, as he patted his piece through his jacket. "But now that I am here, among your presence and fine surround, my breath caught, I am quite content, and can again forget it." The two men exchanged smiles, and Mr. Winter further guided his eyes about the parlour in a gesture that it, a long rectangular room with built-in shelves and cabinets existing in its back part, and a large glass window pouring light into its front, was indeed very fine, well lain for the work of the solitary contemplator. There was a cherrywood desk that kept stylistic company with the shelving, that Mr. Moore, whilst at business, could sit behind and look down the room's length and through the window into his front yard, at its thin collection of olden oaks and sycamores. And the two chairs presently attending the fireplace no doubt usually kept men of Mr. Moore's confidence facing him at his desk to discuss the management of his extensive collection of property throughout Woodbridge and Hedgely. Evidence of his local importance was portrayed by a great map, hung on the wall between the corridor to his library and that of the front window, which carried pinned ribbons that were once used to facilitate the remembrance of the names of hundreds of tenants who did quarterly answer to him. "Please do sit down, sir," the spirited old squire said as he gestured at the second chair. "You may soon after your sweats are becalmed find it cold otherwise, though in the matter I am something of a mystic. I can feel the autumn chill before it arrives to my wife and daughter, my servants, and any other creature roaming the property, either in or outside these walls. Save the kitchen, I believe I'll command the only fire in the house by the afternoon. Come now, and have you a seat." "I will, Mr. Moore," returned Mr. Winter, "but before I do, I will place 2 books I have brought for you onto your desk. I was told, and now am able to see for myself through the corridor behind us, that you have a vast library with a credible section devoted to the knowledge of agriculture. Oh, who told you such a thing? But 'tis true, 'tis true." He humbly laughed. "A bit of Townsend, Young, Sinclair, a few papers from the Board of Agriculture. Just this month my brother, the parson, has sent me enough material concerning the natural arts and observations that my clerk and I will be in no want of occupation for the winter, trying to make any sense of it all. What indeed have you brought for me?" Mr. Moore's eyes shimmered upon the mention of the subject of husbandry, for not only did his fortune rest on the constitution of the fields, as was so recently and painfully obvious from the events of the year 1816, when production, rents and satiated appetites were all curtailed, but so did his heart, concerning the care of his broad-eyed pippins, Chax Hill Reds, and other varieties of apple trees seated inside his orchard. There was pride in the man that his towns, quite viscous in their developmental juices, were still able to moderately compete with those that had more readily embraced the fashionable technology that was ravishing the country. "Ah, one is the Professor, Sir Humphrey Davy, and I shall be sorry if you already have it. It's his collection of lectures he delivered under the Royal Institution by request of the Agriculture Board, entitled Elements of Agricultural Chemistry. I read it perhaps 5 years back, and I intend to do so again shortly, for it is a piece of the puzzle of why I stand before you, and at all in this particular section of the country. Are you familiar with Professor Davy?" The old man's eyes searched the ceiling for Sir Davy as he rested his chin upon his upward-pointing index finger, Then, after a little mumbling, he returned. "There is a fellow who soon could be replacing William Hyde Wollaston as President of the Royal Society, whose name I believe is Davy, a recent baronet. I may indeed have a bit or a piece of your series, or his, I should say, but I am certain I do not own it in full, for which I most sincerely thank you, sir, for your generosity. Please do continue. Your puzzle piece?" "Yes, sir," Mr. Winter enthusiastically replied, for now they were to the plum of the matter. "Well, the book contains a particular chapter on the constituents of soils and that which lies underneath them, but further gives credible instruction on the analysis of these constituents, and briefly describes methods of improvement of such, once one does understand their elemental qualities. There is more to the book than just these. For example, there is a section on the constituents of plants, but it would give me great pleasure were I to be given access to the soils in select fields about the towns, for the purpose of their categorization and comparison. Eventually, once I'm more studied, I would also like to competently suggest means of improvement and conduct several comparatory trials that such would be evidence-based." "Improvement? Trials? My heavens!" the Squire cried, struck by the idea that the town's fields needed any philosophical help at all, having produced rather competently most of the years he had lived among them, though he then inwardly admitted that their performance had noticeably attenuated over the last decade. "Yes, sir, for the purpose of augmenting yield. I will be analysing my own little field, and were it to be found lacking in any nutriment, applying the appropriate remedies and confirming them with a small crop of corn, but it surely is not a proper representative for the entire countryside. I had hoped for more land during my purchase, that I may keep to myself with my experiments at first, and still produce a variety of examples of improvement for the area, but you are aware of the scarcity in this locale, and apparently the previous owner did sell off most of his fields to my neighbours before I stumbled upon him." Mr. Winter then shared his thoughts on the wholesomeness of slow but steady improvement as it applied to the condition of man and earth alike, and whatever fears the Squire may have held, with regard to the volatile uproar taking place elsewhere, by the hands of the other masters of mankind, were credibly quelled. And thusly, when the engineer appealed to the landlord that the man might whisper in a few of his tenants' ears for the cause of his observance and sampling of their fields, at least a few derelict or impoverished ones in want of remedy, he was quite reasonable in his reply. "I am happy to be of service to you, Mr. Winter, especially if your philosophies may prove useful, as in turn they would prove useful to my income, but I must say it is almost neither here nor there, for I found many of these farmers to be most protective of their plots when it comes to exogenous suggestion. I recall several years back, after an uncommon lacking season, I stood before our Society's brethren at one of our monthly meetings, and suggested that some fields that were, merely from tradition, suffering from a want of rotation should not be so, and that we should all take to heart Lord Townsend's wisdom. Yet my offering was met with the quiet staring into pints or toward the walls, and a few of the bolder folk in the room were happy to quote the Bible to me as proof that their present actions inside their fields were just, right, and true. For my part, I only give thanks to the Lord for the corn laws and the rain, and everything else I lay on the stewardship of man. By the by, I would suggest you stay credibly away from two of those fellows, a Mr. Weston and a Mr. Smith, Baptists residing on the southern part of Hedgeley, whose fields are below the grove there, at the lowest leg of Westfield Road. They own their own land, but care nothing for philosophical husbandry, and less for newcomers. Once their antagonists were discounted, however, something of an agreement was struck, and more relaxed topics became their conversation's order. Mr. Winter's qualification for the Agrarian Society was discussed. Certainly his little plot, especially if planted properly, would allow him to attend the meetings held at the Plough during the last Sunday of each month, and there too he may have a chance to appeal to the local farmers directly regarding his designs for improvement. Mr. Winter explained his regret concerning the angle of incidence of the roof of his glass-house, for if he had designed it with multiple angles of glass, giving it a curvilinear shape, there would be more light available inside, and less reflecting off its face for any given season. Alas, They both did agree that, as in most aspects of the work of mankind, money was the limiting factor, and thus he must be content with but a single angled top to his structure. Mr. Moore went a little further into the subject of his apples, and regaled his guest on his visit to Oxfordshire in search of a cultivar called a Blenheim orange that had won the Banksian silver medal that year, and Mr. Winter then inquired about an undercook or an overly experienced kitchen maid that might be ready for a small position as a cook in his little home. During such interval, flashes of white began to appear upon Mr. Winter's rightmost periphery in the direction of the library corridor, and as he explained how a boiler and pipe apparatus, whose water weighed 2,000 pounds, could be motivated to circulate with but a minuscule weight difference regarding the water in the descending pipe, in comparison to that in the boiler, 150 grains to be exact, these flashes became more and more intense until they themselves boiled over into the materialization of Harriet Moore, donning indeed a brilliant white ornamented muslin dress. "I am sorry to disturb you, Uncle, but have you at all seen your old book on British birds that I used to adore some decade ago? It had a dark leather board with golden feathered patterns running about its edges," she asked, having been searching the library for the object she was sure was there just a fortnight ago. "Not at all, my dear, for we were but engaged in friendly discourse," her uncle started, and with the greatest sensitivity to propriety, which called for introductions before the missing book could be addressed, he quickly added, "This is Mr. Thomas Winter. I don't believe you are acquainted. Mr. Winter, this is my niece, Miss Harriet Moore, daughter of our parson, and my brother, Jonathan Moore." Upon Mr. Winter's standing to greet Miss Moore, a pause did develop, one which a sensible person might interpret as a symptom that something was amiss, but the interval hastily vanished as the two made their bows and how-do-you-dos, and with it any interpretation that could so be attached to it. "Don't put too much faith in it, niece, but I did see Charlotte with a piece that fits your description at one of the garden tables a few days back. You'll recall she too adored the thing, and perhaps retrieved it after it had come up in the conversation at dinner last week," offered Mr. Moore, who was not the interpreting type at that moment. "Thank you, sir. I will inquire with her this eve," she said, and observing that Mr. Winter was indeed improperly displaced from the conversation, and looking mildly astonished at her, she further offered, "Mr. Winter, I often walk down King Street, but for the cottages I cannot see what I'm told is your home, save a few shallow glimpses. However, along that self-same road, I do often meet with something of a mutual acquaintance of ours, a little girl, though I am ashamed to say that I do not know her name. She prizes your pippins as much as Uncle does his, and recently I have begged her to leave yours be now that you are among us." "Yes, I know this girl," Mr. Winter laughed. "I've never spoken to her, but I'm enraptured with her curiosity and dedication regarding my yard. She often speaks of your glass house, and how does it come along, if I may ask?" she inquired, noting Mr. Winter's quickness of familiarity with his happy emotive display. "Oh, quite well, thank you. I've just added several large vats which I will fill with water and cap to help absorb and retain the heat from both the sun and the pipes I've added, which cleanly communicate such from an exterior stove-like device during the cold season. I have hopes that these vats will help regulate the temperature inside the place, offering more of a constancy in that regard." "Do not get Mr. Winter entrenched in his structure, dear girl." Mr. Moore, too, then chuckled, "for he is an exceptionally clever man, and from our discussion I'm sure could offer prodigious philosophical and engineering insights from one week's end to the next concerning it. I was just telling him about the time I visited Seas in Cote, about 10 or so miles northeast of here near the town, Morton, which kept a large orangery of stone and great glass windows, done up in a Hindu or Muslim style, as was the rest of the home, save its Greek interior. Cockerell, I think, was the owner's name, and he was just telling me, and let me know if I've smoked your sentiments properly, Mr. Winter, of a George Mackenzie, who recently professed that because the sun is always shining down on us from different parts of the sky in different seasons, that a glass roof of a hemispheric shape, or at least a semicircular shape, would do well for letting in light in all cases. "You have smoked it completely, Mr. Moore," returned Mr. Winter, continuing to smile. And let me add that my own design was modelled after that from the Scottish botanist by the name of John Loudon, which is called the Ridge and Furrow. Despite the Squire's reservation on the endlessness of Mr. Winter's marvel, the three talked at some length upon the subject, and promises were made to visit once there were an established set of experiments flourishing inside of it. Yet during this time, whilst the Moores obliged their curiosity, Miss Moore's countenance started to discreetly pink. This was accompanied by a delicate tickling on the back of her neck, by the awakening of the wisps of hair that resided there, bedewed by the reaction of her skin from what she could not fully attribute to the work of the fireplace.